Welcome to This Explainer. You know, if you're using AI today, you probably just assume the winner of the global AI race is whoever has the deepest pockets, right? Well, looking at the fresh data from 2026, we've stumbled onto a truly fascinating paradox. We're looking at a massive global shift that kind of challenges everything we thought we knew about how technological dominance actually works.
We've got to start with a real wall of cognitive dissonance here. In 2025, the United States poured a staggering $285.9 billion into private AI investment. I mean, to put that into perspective, that is more than the entire GDP of many developed nations just injected straight into research, infrastructure, and startup ecosystems. It's exactly the kind of financial firepower that, historically speaking, guarantees absolute market dominance. But now, contrast that massive number with China, which spent just $12.4 billion. That means the U.S. outspent China by an unbelievable 23-to-1 margin. If innovation was just a simple function of private capital, well, this race would literally be over. The output gap should heavily reflect this investment gap.
But here is the absolute shocker from Stanford's 2026 AI Index. Despite that colossal financial advantage, the U.S. lead in frontier model performance has basically collapsed. It went from a roughly 30% lead back in 2023 to a mere 2.7% today. Think about that for a second. 3 years and hundreds of billions of dollars later, and the performance gap is almost completely wiped out. How on earth do you spend 23 times more money only to end up with a microscopic 2.7% advantage?
Okay, let's dive into exactly how this gap closed. We're going to look at the 2.7% paradox, the hardware bottleneck, the data advantage, the talent pipeline collapse, the open source advantage, and finally, a new global order.
So, Section 1, the 2.7% paradox, doing more with less.
When you look at the underlying metrics here, it is super revealing. While the U.S. definitely leads in pure capital and absolute capabilities with those massive frontier models like Gemini and Claude, China is just extracting dramatically more capability per dollar. They're dominating in patents, leading heavily in publications, and they're installing industrial robots, which is basically physical AI, at 9 times the U.S. rate. So, the U.S. might be winning the sprint in raw absolute model power, but China is using their resources to build this massive foundational infrastructure.
Which brings us to Section 2, the hardware bottleneck, running on a treadmill. Because money usually buys computing power, right? And the hardware gap is absolutely still a massive structural advantage for the U.S. Right now, U.S. and partner manufacturing capacity is something like 35 to 38 times larger. Basically, think of China's hardware situation as running on a ridiculously grueling treadmill. You've got NVIDIA's cutting-edge Blackwell chip pumping out 15 petaflops of compute with super high manufacturing yields of 60 to 80%. But on the flip side, Huawei's Ascend 950 PR Max is out at just a tenth of that performance. In their manufacturing yields, they're stuck somewhere between 5 and 20% because they're hitting the physical limits of their 7-nanometer processes.
But, and this is a big but, there's been this wild unintended consequence of U.S. export controls. By strictly restricting those top-tier NVIDIA chips, it accidentally created this heavily protected domestic market inside China. Because of this, homegrown chips from companies like Huawei and Threads are expected to grab 80% of China's market this year. Meanwhile, NVIDIA's share, which used to be totally dominant over there, is actually forecasted to collapse down to just 8%.
All right, Section 3, the data advantage, breadth versus scale. Now, hardware obviously isn't the only input, because an AI model is really only as good as the data it trains on. And this data divide is essentially this epic battle of breadth versus scale. The US holds a very distinct breadth advantage because English is the lingua franca of the internet and they have massive open repositories like GitHub for coding data. But China possesses this totally unreplicable scale advantage. They have 1.4 billion citizens generating data behind a firewall, all supported by 110,000 government-backed, high-quality datasets covering everything from healthcare to heavy industry. Each side has a structural advantage that the other just literally cannot copy.
Next up, Section 4, the talent pipeline collapse, the 100K talent tax.
So if China is struggling on hardware but totally flush with data, how are they closing the technical gap so incredibly fast? Well, human capital is arguably the single most important metric in all of this, and recent U.S. policy shifts, specifically this new $100,000 H-1B visa fee that went into effect in February 2026, have acted as a massive talent tax. Sure, the tech giants can afford that without blinking, but it severely impacts seed-stage startups who are just trying to hire top global researchers. And as a direct result of these shifting policies, get this, Switzerland has incredibly overtaken the US. They now rank #1 globally in AI talent concentration per capita.
And the fallout from this has been absolutely staggering. We've seen an 89% drop in AI researcher immigration to the United States over the past 7 years. But the crazy part? A full 80% of that decline happened in just the last year alone. The brain drain that originally built Silicon Valley's AI dominance really appears to be actively reversing.
Which leads us to Section 5, the open source advantage, rewriting what's possible.
With global talent shifting and researchers either staying home or moving to places like Zurich, the crucial point really becomes output efficiency. Chinese entities are just doing vastly more with less. They are now filing a staggering 69.7% of all global AI patents. This massive surge in research and development has actually helped them capture 60% of the world's total AI patent holdings. They are literally flooding the zone with research.
And this incredible efficiency is totally proven by their open source models. Just look at DeepSeek R1. This thing was built in just 2 months for under $6 million. I mean, that is literally pocket change in the AI world. Yet it scored a 97.4% on the math benchmark, completely rivaling top-tier US models. Then you've got Alibaba's Qwen family of models, which now boasts 942 million downloads. By heavily focusing on open source and pushing high performance at a much lower cost, models like Qwen have essentially become the default foundation for developers all across Asia and the global south.
Finally, let's look at Section 6, a new global order, governing the future. All of these converging factors we've talked about, the closing performance gap, the talent shift, the open source dominance, they all lead to some massive global implications. We are currently living in what you could call a trust paradox. According to the Stanford report, 88% of organizations are using AI. Adoption is just exploding. Chances are you use generative AI today, but trust is hitting rock bottom. Only 31% of the US public actually trusts their government to regulate it effectively. And honestly, this skepticism makes a lot of sense when you realize there were 362 recorded AI incidents in 2025 alone.
This total lack of centralized global trust, combined with these diverging technological pathways, really paved the way for a brand new institution, the World Artificial Intelligence Cooperation Organization, or WICO. And this thing moved at lightning speed for an intergovernmental body. It went from a July 2025 proposal by Xi Jinping to an APEC reiteration to a fully finalized agreement signed just yesterday on July 16, 2026.
Signed in Shanghai by 29 independent countries, and we're talking major players here like Brazil, Russia, South Africa, and Indonesia, and remarkably attended by the UN Secretary-General, WICO represents a major geopolitical shift. It creates a completely independent intergovernmental body entirely focused on AI development tailored for the global south, operating completely outside of traditional Western tech frameworks.
Which leaves us with a really critical question as we wrap up this explainer. We've seen exactly how a 23-to-1 financial advantage somehow only yielded a 2.7% performance lead. So, if the US strategy relies so heavily on pure capital and brute force computing power, what happens to that incredibly narrow 2.7% advantage when the global talent pipeline, the actual people who convert those billions of dollars into breakthroughs, finally runs dry?